Section 40 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, The Fertilisation of Flowers, Part 3. Risks of fertilization being omitted altogether are not lost sight of in the economy of nature, and such contingencies are often duly provided for in remarkable ways. In Myosotis versicolor, for instance, there is an evident intent to prevent self-fertilization from the fact that the pistil projects far above the stamens in the young flower and is therefore a likely object to be touched by an insect which has come from another forget-me-not, as this flower is often named. But such an arrangement dependent on insect visitation might be rendered futile if no insect happened to alight on the flower. In due time, however, the corolla is seen to increase in length. As it grows upwards, the stamens are carried upwards, until in due time they attain the level of the stigma, and by discharging their pollen upon it will fertilize the pistil if it has not already undergone that process from a foreign source. Such a contrivance appears tantamount to the declaration on the part of plant nature that although cross-fertilization is sought and preferred, yet self-fertilization is better than none. Besides the means just noted, there exist a large number of expedients in flowers for securing fertilization. These latter contrivances relating to the form and shapes of flowers, to the special positions of its organs, and to adaptive details of flower structure. The polity of a primrose in the peculiar situation of its stamens and pistils, as adapted to secure cross-fertilization, falls under this latter division of floral expedients. And so, also, would all these peculiarities of stamens whereby the discharge of pollen in a fashion adapted to avoid self-fertilization is secured. In some flowers, for example Parnassia, as the 5 stamens ripen one after the other, before the pistil, as it happens, each anther is laid back downwards, so to speak, on the stigma or top of the pistil, so that the pollen escapes by the side farthest from the stigma, and self-fertilization thus becomes well nigh an impossibility. But even the form and shape or color of a corolla or blossom may be adapted either of itself, or when associated with other expedients, to secure cross-fertilization in a special conjunction with insect aid. It has been pointed out that every flower of peculiar shape is cross-fertilized by insects. As notable instances of this fact may be cited the peas, beans, dead nettles, sage, salvia, orchids, the peculiar shape of whose flowers, as well as the special arrangements of stamens and pistil, are correlated in the most exact positions to compel insects to visit the special parts of the flower, and thus to ensure the exact performance of the work of cross-fertilization. Even the distribution of color on a flower, and the particular spots or dashes which attract our notice, are guides and finger-posts directing insects to the honey. Sprengel of old called these special color guides maculae indicantes, and Mr. Darwin remarks that Sprengel's ideas seemed to him for a long time fanciful. But the fact that these markings are most commonly met with on unsymmetrical or irregular flowers, the entrance into which would be more likely to puzzle and confuse insects than the apertures of symmetrical flowers, weighs in favor of dashes and spots of color being truly directive in function. Mr. Darwin further remarks that, in the common pelargonium, the marks in question, borne on the 2 upper petals, are clearly related to the position of the nectary or honey store of the flower. For when the flowers vary so as to become regular and lose their nectaries, the marks disappear. When the nectary is in part undeveloped, only one of the upper petals loses its characteristic mark. It is true that humblebees are known to bite through the petals of flowers and to surreptitiously suck the honey through the apertures thus made, and even hive bees learn to utilize the holes made by their larger brethren. But notwithstanding this latter fashion of securing stolen sweets, a method indicative of a certain power of development in bee intellect, there can be little doubt that originally to bees, as at present to insects who walk in the trodden paths of their race, the color marks and special hues of flowers are serviceable, as Mr. Darwin remarks, in guiding insect visitors rapidly and without loss of time to the store of sweets, and in thus enabling them to visit a larger number of flowers in a given time than would otherwise be possible. Sir John Lubbock remarks that he did not realize the import of these markings in flowers until he saw how much time bees lost if honey which has been put out for them is even slightly moved from its usual place. Whilst it forms an allied subject of the most interesting description, To speculate upon the remarkable changes in color which some plants undergo, and which, like the times of opening and closing, are doubtless related to the visits of insects. Thus we know of some flowers, hibiscus, which are white in the morning, of a pale rose hue at midday, and exhibit a bright rosy red color in the evening. Many flowers change their hues as the petals wax old and tend to fall off, and that such alterations of hue have a reference to insect visits and attract, it may be, insects of different tastes and structure at different periods, is by no means a far-fetched speculation. The presence of bright colors in flowers has been shown to bear an important relation to fertilization, and necessarily, through this latter process, to the development of such species of plants. Bright hues are, as a rule, associated in flowers with a faint development, or even a want of scent. Insects being attracted by one quality or the other, the presence of scent would be useless where color is well developed. If we compare such flowers as pelargoniums, convolvulus, pansy, fertilia, etc., which are conspicuous and bright-tinted, but scentless, with the primrose, lily of the valley, rose, and hyacinth, which are not so conspicuous, but emit powerful odors, we can realize the principle of nature's economy in avoiding over-lavish provisions for insect attraction. The correlation between flower and insect is even more strongly marked, however, when we discover that flowers which are fertilized by night-flying moths are usually of white color, so as to appear conspicuous at night, and may further emit their odor only or chiefly at night. Such flowers as Daphne and Hesperus, obscurely colored as it happens, attract insects solely by their powerful odor. Nagelli's experiment of scenting artificial flowers with essential oils was followed by the attraction of insects in an unmistakable manner. The description of a few of the most typical cases in which cross-fertilization is found may fitly conclude the more exact consideration of the present topic, and preface the abstract philosophy which directs attention to the bearing of the facts of fertilization on the constitution and regulation of the world of life at large. A very interesting mechanism for effecting cross-fertilization is seen in the case of flowers which, like the peas, beans, and their leguminous neighbors, present a very characteristic form of blossom. These flowers possess 10 stamens, 9 united to form a bundle, and 1 remaining single. The flower is peculiar in that it consists of 1 very large petal behind or above, 2 at the sides or wings, and 2 united to form the boat-shaped keel below. When an insect alights on the side petals or wings, the keel is thereby pressed downwards. The pollen of the stamens and the tip of the pistil are made to project so as respectively to dust the insect's breast with pollen, and to receive therefrom the foreign pollen gathered previously from another flower. Sprengel himself noticed that the union of the stamens favored this conjoined action. When the weight of the insect's body is removed, the stamens and pistil resume their normal position. If, as Sir John Lubbock remarks, quote, the 2 ends of the wings in a sweet pea be taken between the finger and thumb and pressed down so as to imitate the effect produced by the pressure of an insect, the keel is depressed with the wings, while the pistil and stamens are thus partly uncovered. Unquote. In the bean, when the wings are similarly pressed down, the stigma of the pistil and then the beard of the style, laden with pollen, project from the keel, which is of coiled conformation. When a bee exercises the necessary pressure, the pistil of the bean will first strike its body and become fertilized by fresh pollen, whilst the pollen-laden style of the flower will, secondly, leave fertilizing matter on the bee's body for application to the pistil of another flower. A dead nettle with its irregular flower presents a favorable and readily understood example of the manner in which a special form of flower is adapted for the special insect which cross-fertilizes it. A bank of dead nettles is to humble bees what a country fair is to juveniles, in that it presents the insects with a store of sweets specially intended for their delectation. In shape, the sage or dead nettle flower, as everyone knows, exhibits a wide mouth, bounded by a very much arched upper lip, whilst a divided lower lip is also conspicuous enough. The green cup-like calyx has its sepals united, whilst the very irregularly shaped corolla is composed of united petals. There are 4 stamens, 2 long and 2 short, the 5th stamen of botanical expectation being abortive. The stamens are peculiar in position, inasmuch as they lie along the arch of the petals instead of surrounding the pistil. The style is very long and forked at its tip, and it moreover depends below the anthers as in fuchsia. The honey for which the bees visit the dead nettle is situated far down within the flower, and if we make a vertical section of the corolla, we shall find a circle of hairs placed inside the petals at their lower portion. Now, in what special fashion is the mechanism thus described brought into play in the fertilization of the dead nettle tribe? The reply may be found in a simple study of a dead nettle on a warm summer's day, when insect life and the blossoming of flowers together seem to attain the acme of activity and development. The bee approaches the flower and finds in the lower lip of the blossom a convenient doormat on which to alight. Here the insect gains a point d'appui for the movement of the proboscis, which probes the depths of the corolla so as to reach the nectar, and easily thrusts aside the circlet of stiff hairs, presenting an impassable barrier to a less robust, as well as uninvited, insect guest. The acts of the insect insofar as the work of honey-getting is concerned, and thus. Meanwhile, however, it has likewise been performing its unconscious part in the fertilization of the flower. The position of the stamens under the hooded petal has been noted. Such a position assures two results. Firstly, that the stamen shall be brought in contact with the bee's body, and secondly, that the pistil shall likewise touch the insect in order that foreign pollen obtained from a previously visited dead nettle shall be deposited on the stigma. The stigma, as we have seen, depends below the anthers. Hence it must be the first object with which the bee comes in contact. Fertilization by the foreign pollen is thus secured before the stamens have dusted the insect with the flower's own pollen. As Dr. Ogle has pointed out, the position of the stamens doubtless facilitates, in a marked degree, the proper placing of pollen on the insect's body. If the anthers had lain side by side, the bee's head might have been dusted on parts which do not touch the stigma as the insect enters the flower, whilst even the eyes of the bees might have become disadvantageously covered with pollen. There is, in short, the closest possible correlation between the structure of the flower and the form and size of the insect which fertilizes it. Such correlation is exhibited in, if anything, an increased degree in the genus Salvia, belonging to the dead nettle order Labiatae, also including the sage. Salvia attracted the notice of Sprengel, rector at Spandau, who in his Das entdeckte Geheimnis der Natur im Bau und in der Befruchtung der Blumen, The Secrets of Nature in the Structure and Fertilization of Flowers, published in 1793, was one of the first to direct attention to the fact that nature's law was cross and not self-fertilization, or as he himself expressed it, quote, "Nature does not desire that any complete flower should be fertilized by its own pollen." Unquote. It is interesting to note that a species of Salvia, S. splendens, occurring in the New World, appears to be cross-fertilized through the agency of hummingbirds, these fairy-like birds thus discharging, in this case, the functions of the insects to which some species approach so nearly in size. The trumpet creepers, Tecoma radicans, and trumpet honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervivens, are probably fertilized by moths and by hummingbirds as well. In Salvia officinalis, the general form of which closely resembles that of the dead nettle, the stamens ripen before the pistil, and as, moreover, the stigma is placed above the anthers, self-fertilization is an impossibility. When, however, the stamens have shed their pollen, they shrivel up, and the pistil, as it ripens, develops the stigma so that it elongates, curves downwards, and thus assumes a position in which it cannot escape contact with the back of the bee entering the flower. The insect's back, it may be noted, is exactly that region which the ripe stamens in a younger and necessarily different flower will have dusted with foreign pollen. But the economy of Salvia includes yet other appliances for more effectually securing fertilization by the insect. There are but two well-developed stamens in the flower. These organs have widely separated anther cells, and when in an undisturbed condition, each stamen is seen to consist of a stalk, the filament, to which another and movable stalk, the connective, bearing an anther cell at each end, is attached. Only one of these anther cells is fully developed in each stamen. The connective, like a swing bar, can be pushed backwards on its axis so as to bring the fully developed or upper anther cell to a horizontal position. Such a result is actually brought about by the bee. Thrusting its head into the flower in the search for nectar, the insect pushes before it the lower end of the swing bar, and thus brings the upper end of the bar with its ripe anther in contact with its back. This latter region is thus dusted with pollen, and when the insect flies to another salvia flower in which the pistil is ripe, the stigma, as we have seen, will in due course receive the pollen through contact with the back of the bee. A single paragraph only is permissible regarding the curious details connected with the fertilization of the orchids, which possess flowers of markedly irregular shape. The lip in such a flower as Orchis mascula, a common British species, is very broad, whilst the nectary to which bees desire admittance is extremely long. The pollen forms two club-shaped masses, each adherent to a disc, which in turn lies within the rostulum or cup. When touched, the rostulum breaks across and thus allows the two glutinous discs to become exposed. When a bee visits this peculiar flower, it pushes its proboscis into the nectary for the sake of the honey contained therein. At the same time, the insect comes in contact with the discs of the pollen masses, these masses becoming adherent to the insect's head. A pencil pushed into an orchis detaches pollen masses after the fashion of the insect's unconscious act. At first, the pollen masses remain erect like two abnormal horns on the insect's head, but gradually they assume a horizontal position, so that the insect cannot fail to charge the next orchid pistil it enters with the pollen masses. The stigma, or top of the pistil, is so placed in these flowers that pollen masses borne on a bee's head are certain to strike this surface, and thus fertilize the contents of the ovary. It is probable that as each pollen mass consists of several packets of pollen grains, one mass may contain material enough to fertilize several flowers, each stigma, through its viscid surface, detaching sufficient pollen from the mass for its fertilization. The admirable adaptation of flower to insect and insect to flower thus witnessed is in no detail better exemplified than in the fact that the pollen mass at first retains a vertical and then assumes a horizontal position in the insect's head. So long as the pollen mass is vertical, fertilization is impossible, and hence the vertical position persists so long as the bee is engaged in visiting the flowers of the plant from which it has derived pollen masses. Thus, self-fertilization is prevented, so that, as Sir John Hooker puts it, by the time the horizontal position of the pollen mass is assumed, quote, the bee has visited all the flowers of the plant from which it took the pollen and has gone to another plant, unquote. To enter into further illustration of the contrivances through which the fertilization of flowers is secured would be to encroach on the province of the technical and practical botanist. Such details are writ large in the pages of every botanical textbook. In the works of Mr. Darwin, and especially in the fertilization of orchids, the reader anxious for further details may find a perfect encyclopedia of facts, constituting a veritable romance of botanical science. It, however, remains to us in the present instance to point out the plain meaning of these virtually marvelous adaptations of the plant world to the work of cross-fertilization, and to note, as far as possible, the bearing of such a study upon the order of nature regarded as a harmonious whole. It is a perfectly legitimate supposition that if cross-fertilization forms, as we have seen, such a prominent feature of plant life, that life must, in some very plain and obvious fashion, benefit therefrom. And further, as plant life is but a part of organic nature, we may feel perfectly justified in supposing that the conditions and results which cross-fertilization tends to evoke and produce will harmonize in their tendency and direction with the course of events through which the living universe has been and is being molded, developed, and evolved. To the question, why does cross-fertilization appear to be favored by nature over self-fertilization, a plain reply is at hand in a comparison of the results which accrue from each of these processes. Mr. Darwin's laborious researches on the comparative fertility of various species of plants when self-fertilized and cross-fertilized supply an answer to the foregoing question, by showing that in every respect the cross-fertilized flowers yield more seeds and give rise to a stronger and more numerous progeny than the self-fertilized. The reader who consults Mr. Darwin's Forms of Flowers will find himself supplied with ample data in proof of the advantages of cross-fertilization. In the primrose, for instance, when short-styled and long-styled flowers were crossed in what Darwin calls legitimate union, the result was invariably to produce a larger number of seeds than when each form was fertilized by its own pollen. Out of the 12 long-styled primroses fertilized by short-styled pollen, 11 good capsules or ripe pistils were produced. with an average of 66.9 seeds per capsule, whilst 21 long-styled flowers fertilized by long-styled pollen produced only 14 capsules, with an average of 52.2 seeds per capsule. The cowslip gave a similar result, and the tendency towards greater vigor of offspring when cross-fertilization is employed appears to be of the most general kind. In some plants, indeed, cross-fertilization is absolutely essential for the mere continuance of the race, so that this method of seed production is not merely accidental or advantageous, but absolutely necessary for the continuance of the race. Most of the orchids illustrate this state of matters. The presence of humblebees is well nigh an absolute necessity for the continuance of the heartsease viola tricolor, and the well-known case of the clovers may be cited as highly characteristic of the benefits developed through cross-fertilization. 20 heads of Dutch clover protected by Darwin from bees yielded no seeds, whilst 20 heads growing exposed as in a state of nature yielded 2,290 seeds. 100 heads of red clover protected from bees were absolutely sterile. A second 100 exposed yielded 2,700 seeds. The scientific demonstration of the interdependence of living beings becomes in this fashion perfectly clear. Carried out to its ultimate results, such demonstration becomes sufficiently startling. British brain and sinew depend, according to a foreign estimate, on home-fed beef, whilst the quality of that nutriment is said to be dependent upon the clover on which the ox subsists. But clover owes its continuance to humblebees. Humblebees, in turn, are killed by field mice, whilst cats extirpate the rodents. As old maids conserve the feline race, it is alleged that the continuance of the British intellect is dependent upon such conservation, so that a scientific justification of spinsterhood is thus rendered possible. Sprengel laid down the axiom already mentioned that nature does not wish any complete flower to be self-fertilized. Darwin, in turn, improves upon this dictum in his assertion that nature abhors perpetual self-fertilization, that cross-fertilization is generally beneficial and self-fertilization injurious is thus a stable result of botanical investigation. This result may not enable us fully to comprehend that law within the law which regulates the well-being of the plant world, but it may at least lead us plainly enough to a nearer fact of life, namely, that there exists in nature an innate tendency to variation and change, and that by furthering the fullest possible development of seeds, as well as by the cross-fertilizing of plants, there is being illustrated that tendency to evolve new varieties and species on the existence of which the very idea and possibility of evolution depends. The tendency to produce a more numerous offspring gives naturally a larger number of individuals for the exhibition and operation of the laws of variation. The process of cross-fertilization itself produces another tendency to variation, and as such variation is the keynote of evolution, it is more than interesting to find the conditions of plant life in such a marked manner contributing to the differentiation of the species. The whole array of features embraced in a study of flower fertilization forms simply a mass of evidence that the production of new races and varieties, and through these of new species, is part and parcel of nature's constitution. On any other supposition, the extraordinary array of contrivances favoring cross-fertilization and the initiation of variations is meaningless and utterly inexplicable. The facts of fertilization, like the stages of development, present us with unimpeachable evidence in favor of the evolution of new races by the modification of the old. Even if a fact here or a detail there may seem to weigh against the theory of development, it must be borne in mind, firstly, that defects and gaps in our knowledge are still realities of biological science, and, secondly, that the general, and in this case the immensely overwhelming, probability of nature's and life's methods testifies to evolution as the true way of creation. Mr. Darwin succinctly enough says that his experiments on intercrossing show that, quote, with animals and plants, a cross between different varieties, or between individuals of the same variety, but of another strain, give vigor and fertility to the offspring, and on the other hand, that close interbreeding diminishes vigor and fertility, unquote. And he also adds that such facts, quote, alone incline me to believe that it is a general law of nature that no organic being fertilizes itself for a perpetuity of generations, but that a cross with another individual is occasionally, perhaps at long intervals of time, indispensable." Unquote. Remarking the strange feature of the stamens and pistil of most flowers being placed close together, quote, "as if for the very purpose of self-fertilization," unquote, and yet being, quote, "mutually useless to each other," unquote, Mr. Darwin says, quote, "How simply are these facts explained on the view of an occasional cross with a distinct individual being advantageous or indispensable." Unquote. Thus, from the common ground that cross-fertilization effects the greatest good in nature, namely the efficient increase of the race, we may find many roads and ways for the recognition of further effects of such action in favoring the operation of the conditions that increase the species by variation and modification. The full bearing of the subject may not be completely investigated for years to come. Sufficient, however, is our present recognition of the fact that in the work of flower fertilization lie the beginnings of those activities and processes which herald now, as of yore, not merely the increase, but the variation of species and the evolution of new forms of plants. Certain matters bearing the same relation to our present subject that the inevitable moral bears to the fable, albeit that they may perchance be regarded as of somewhat superfluous nature, may fitly be touched upon in closing this paper. Our notions of special ends, aims, and contrivances in nature may in one way be enlarged by the considerations which the phenomena of flower fertilization present to notice. Under the operation of laws and conditions, most of which are as yet beyond our ken, we see insect acting upon flower, and flower in turn reacting upon insect, until the interdependence in some cases proceeds so far that the extinction of the insect means the disappearance of the flower. But whilst viewing the beauty of form and hue exhibited in the plant world as wrought out by laws of development, and as accessory or even primary conditions in the evolution of living beings, the new and higher aspects of the subject bid us regard floral beauty as subserving other and higher uses than those commonly assigned to it, namely, of ministering to the often dull and inappreciative senses of man. We may detect a higher purpose in plant life than is included in the yet too common idea that man's delight and human interests exclusively determine and rule through what some are pleased to call the beneficence of Providence, and the concerns of nature at large. The utilitarian cry of use and no use is by no means extinct, even in these latter days, and the consideration of the ways and means involved in the fertilization of flowers must devolve a strong argument against the homocentric idea that the beautiful in nature exists solely for the behalf of man. Darwin says, quote, "Such doctrines, if true, would be absolutely fatal to my theory," unquote. But there is little fear that the hypothesis in question can suffer from arguments familiar in days when natural theology was strained and wrested to its destruction. A truer and a higher use for the beauty of plants and of animals as well is found in the special advantages which such beauty confers upon the race. In the animal, beauty appears as an aid to the propagation of the species, as it is in the plant, and it is by the action of insects that the beauty of flowers has been extended and developed. The beauty of the blossom is in truth due to the visitations of the insect races which in the past have selected its petals as a feeding ground, and which have strengthened and increased the flower race, thus favored by a true natural selection, in the universal struggle for existence. The higher ideas of nature thus implanted form no mean fruits of a study of the polity of primroses and other common flowers. Such studies correct the idea that this world is simply a huge workshop, filled with specially contrived mechanical appliances for man's use and benefit, or a gaudy saloon decked out with beauty for the indulgence of his senses. Those who hold such views may not complain if their belief be logically extended to include the theory that fur seals were specially created to afford us sealskin jackets, and hummingbirds designed to trim the hats of fair wearers in the fleeting fashion of the hour. So that if no greater excellence be traceable in the theory of evolution than is involved in the correction of false notions of the aims and ends of nature, those who pursue science studies, even to this extent, will reap a rich harvest of rational ideas concerning the true ordering of this universe, especially within the domain of life itself. End of section 40. End of Chapter 14, The Fertilization of Flowers, Part 3. Section 41 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 1. It cannot be gainsaid that a survey of the fields of life around us impresses one with the idea that the general tendencies of living nature gravitate towards progression and improvement, and are modeled on lines which, as von Baer long ago remarked, lead from the general or simple towards the definite, special, and complex. This much is admitted on all hands, and the ordinary courses of life substantiate the aphorism that progress from low grades and humble ways is the law of the organic universe that hems us in on every side, and of which, indeed, we ourselves form part. The growth of plant life, which runs concurrently with the changing seasons of the year, impresses this fact upon us, and the history of animal development but repeats the tale. In the passage from seed to seed leaf, from seed leaf to stem and leaves, from simple leaves to flower, and from flower to fruit, there is exhibited a natural progress in plant existence, which testifies eloquently enough, by analogy at least, to the existence of like tendencies in all other forms of life. Similarly, in the animal hosts, progressive change is seen to convert that which is literally at first without form and void into the definite structure of the organism. A minute speck of protoplasm on the surface of the egg, a speck that is indistinguishable insofar as its matter is concerned from the materies of the animalcule of the pool, is the germ of the bird of the future. Day by day, the forces and powers of development weave the protoplasm into cells, and the cells in turn into bone and muscle, sinew and nerve, heart and brain. In due season, the form of the higher vertebrate is evolved, and progressive change is once more illustrated before the waiting eyes of life science. But the full meaning of most of the problems which life science presents to view is hardly gained by a merely cursory inspection of what may be called the normal side of things. The bypaths of development, more frequently perhaps than its beaten tracks, reveal guiding clues and traces of the manner in which the progress in question has come to pass. So also the side avenues of biology open up new phases of, it may be, the main question at issue, and may reveal, as in the present instance, an interesting reverse to the aspects we at first deem of sole and paramount importance. For example, a casual study of the facts of animal development is well calculated to show that life is not all progress, and that it includes retrogression as well as advance. Physiological history can readily be proved to tend in many cases towards backsliding instead of reaching forwards and upwards to higher levels. This latter tendency, beginning now to be better recognized in biology than of late years, can readily be shown to exercise no unimportant influence on the fortunes of animals and plants. In truth, life at large must now be regarded as existing between two great tendencies, the one progressive and advancing, the other retrogressive and degenerating. Such a view of matters may serve to explain many things in living histories which have hitherto been regarded as somewhat occult and difficult of solution, whilst we may likewise discover that the coexistence of progress and retrogression is a fact perfectly compatible with the lucid opinions and teachings concerning the origin of living things which we owe to the genius of Darwin and his disciples. A fundamental axiom of modern biology declares that in the development of a living being, we may discern a panoramic unfolding, more or less complete, of its descent. Development repeats descent is an aphorism which, as we have seen, cultured biology has everywhere writ large over its portals. Rejecting this view of development and its teachings, the phases through which animals and plants pass in the course of their progress from the germ to the adult stage present themselves to view as simply meaningless facts and useless freaks and vagaries of nature. Accepting the idea favored, one may add, by every circumstance of life science, much that was before wholly inexplicable becomes plain and readily understood. And the view that a living being's development is really a quick and often abbreviated summary of its evolution and descent both receives support from and gives countenance to the general conclusion that life's forces tend as a rule towards progress, but likewise exhibit retrogression and degeneration. If a living being is found to begin its history, as all animals and plants commence their existence, as a speck of living jelly comparable to the adult animalcule of the pool, it is a fair and logical inference that the organisms in question have descended from lowly beings whose simplicity of structure is repeated in the primitive nature of the germ. If, to quote another illustration, the placid frog of today, after passing through its merely protoplasmic stage, appears before us in the likeness of a gill-breathing fish, the assumption is plain and warrantable that the frog race has descended from some primitive fish stock, whose likeness is reproduced with greater or less exactness in the tadpoles of the ditches. Or if, to cite yet another example, man and his neighbor quadrupeds, birds and reptiles, which never breathed by gills at any period of their existence, are found in an early stage of development to possess gill arches, such as we naturally expect to see and such as we find in the fishes themselves. The deduction that these higher animals are descended from gill-bearing or aquatic ancestors seems to admit of no reasonable denial. On any other theory, the existence of gill arches in the young of an animal which never possesses gills is to be viewed as an inexplicable freak of nature, a dictum which, it is needless to remark, belongs to an era one might well term pre-scientific in comparison with the sweetness and light of these latter days. Hanging very closely on the aphorism respecting development and its meaning is another biological axiom, well nigh as important as the former. If development teaches that life has been and still is progressive in its ways, and that the simpler stages in an animal's history represent the conditions of its earliest ancestors, it is a no less stable proposition that at all stages of their growth, living beings are subject to the action of outward and inward forces. Every living organism lives under the sway and dominance of forces acting upon it from without, and which it is enabled to modify and to utilize by its own inherent capabilities of action. It is, in fact, the old problem of the living being and its surroundings applied to the newer conceptions of life and nature which modern biology has revealed. The living thing is not a stable unit in its universe, however wide or narrow that sphere may be. On the contrary, it exists in a condition of continual war, if one may so put it, between its own innate powers of life and action, of living and being, and the physical powers and conditions outside. This much is now accepted by all scientists. Differences of opinion certainly exist as to the share which the internal constitution of the living being plays in the drama of life and progress. It seems, however, most reasonable to conclude that two parties exist to this, as to every other bargain, and regarding the animal or plant as plastic in its nature, we may assume such plasticity to be modified on the one hand by outside forces and on the other by internal actions proper to the organism as a living thing. Examples of such tendencies of life are freely scattered everywhere in nature's domain. For instance, we know of many organisms which have continued from the remotest ages to the present time without manifest change of form or life, and which appear before us today the living counterparts of their fossilized representatives of the chalk, or it may be of Silurian or Cambrian times. The lamp shells, Terebracula, of the chalk exist in our own seas with well-nigh inappreciable differences. The Lingula, or Lingulella, another genus of these animals, has persisted from the Cambrian age to our own times, presenting little or no change for the attention of the geological chronicler. The curious king crabs, or Limulae, of the West Indies are likewise presented to our view with little or no variation from very early ages of cosmical history, and of the pearly nautilus, now remaining as the only existing four-gilled and externally shelled cuttlefish, the same remark holds good. The fishes, likewise, are not without their parallel instances of lack of change and alteration throughout long ages of time. The well-known case of the genus Beryx presents us with a fish of high organization, found living in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and which possesses fossil representatives and facsimiles in the chalk. From the latter period to the present day, the genus Beryx has therefore undergone little modification or change. The same remark certainly holds good of many of those huge dragons of the prime which reveled in the seas of the Trias, Oolite, and chalk epochs. developed in immense numbers in these eras of Earth's history, but disappearing forever from the lists of living things at the close of the Cretaceous Age, and exhibiting little or no change during their relatively brief history. Such cases of stability amidst conditions which might well have favored change, and which saw copious modification and progression in other groups of animals, might at first sight be regarded as presenting a serious obstacle to the doctrine of progressive development on which the whole theory of evolution depends. As such an obstacle, the series of facts in question was long regarded. In this light, these facts are sometimes even now advanced, but only by those who imperfectly appreciate and only partially understand what the doctrine of evolution teaches and what its leading idea includes. Even Cuvier himself, when advancing the case of the apparently unchanged mummies of Egyptian animals against Lamarck's doctrine of descent, failed, possibly through the imperfectly discussed stage in which the whole question rested in his day, to understand that the very facts of preservation revealed in the monuments of Egypt testified to the absence of those physical changes which could alone have affected the animals of the Nile land. But the fuller consideration of that theory of nature which credits progressive change as the usual way of life shows us that it is no part of evolution to maintain either that living beings must needs undergo continual change, or that they must change and modify at the same rate. On the contrary, Mr. Darwin, in his classic work, maintains exactly the opposite proposition. There are, in fact, two great factors at work in living nature: a tendency to vary and change, and the influence of environments or surroundings. Given the first tendency, which is not at all a matter of dispute, the influence of the second is plainly enough discernible in bringing to the front either the original, primitive, or as it might be named, the parent form, or the varying forms which are produced by the modification of the parent. As has been well put, quote, "Granting the existence of the tendency to the production of variations, then whether the variations which are produced shall survive and supplant the parent, or whether the parent form shall survive and supplant the variations, is a matter which depends entirely on those conditions which give rise to the struggle for existence. If the surrounding conditions are such that the parent form is more competent to deal with them and flourish in them than the derived forms, then in the struggle for existence the parent form will maintain itself, and the derived forms will be exterminated. But if, on the contrary, the conditions are such as to be more favorable to a derived than to a parent form, the parent form will be extirpated, and the derived form will take its place. In the first case, there will be no progression, no change of structure, through any imaginable series of ages. In the second place, there will be modification and change of form." Unquote. To the same end, Darwin himself leads us. In one or two pregnant passages, the author of the theory of natural selection very plainly indicates why progression should not be universal, and why certain beings remain lowly organized whilst others attain to the summit and pinnacle of their respective organizations. "How is it," says Darwin, quote, "that throughout the world a multitude of the lowest forms still exist? And how is it that in each great class some forms are far more highly developed than others? Why have not the more highly developed forms everywhere supplanted and exterminated the lower?" Unquote. Answering his own queries, Darwin says that natural selection by no means includes, quote, "progressive development. It only takes advantage," he remarks, "of such variations as arise and are beneficial to each creature under its complex relations of life." And it may be asked, what advantage, as far as we can see, would it be to an infrasarian animalcule, to an intestinal worm, or even to an earthworm to be highly organized? If it were no advantage, these forms would be left, by natural selection, unimproved or but little improved, and might remain for ages in their present lowly condition. And geology tells us that some of the lowest forms, as the foraminifera, infusoria, and rhizopods, have remained for an enormous period in nearly their present state. But, adds Darwin, with a characteristically impartial view of matters, quote, "To suppose that most of the many now existing low forms have not in the least advanced since the first dawn of life would be extremely rash. For every naturalist who has dissected some of the beings now ranked as very low in the scale must have been struck with their really wondrous and beautiful organization." Unquote. Thus, one of the plainest facts of natural history, namely, that in even one group or class of animals we find forms of exceedingly low structure included along with animals of high organization, the apparently diverse bodies being readily modeled on the one and the same type, is explained by the consideration that with different conditions, or with varied conditions acting differently upon unlike constitutions, we expect to find extreme differences in the rank to which the members of a class may attain. In the class of fishes, we find the worm-like clear-bodied lancelet of an inch long, associated with the ferocious shark, the active dogfish, or the agile food fishes of our table. But, as Darwin remarks, the shark would not tend to supplant the lancelet, their spheres and their conditions of existence being of diverse nature. The same remark applies to many other classes of living beings, so that lowly beings still live as such amongst us and preserve the primitive simplicity of their race, firstly, because the conditions of life and their limited numbers may not have induced any great competition or struggle for existence. On the let well alone principle, we may understand why some animals, such as the lancelet itself, have lagged behind in the race after progress. Then, secondly, as Darwin remarks, favorable variations by way of beginning the work of progress may never have appeared, a result due probably as much to hidden causes within the living being as to outside conditions. We may not fail to note, lastly, that the simpler and more uniform these latter conditions are, as represented in the abysses of the ocean, for example, the less incentive is there for the progress and evolution of the races which dwell in their midst. This somewhat lengthy introduction to the subject of degeneration and its results is in its way necessary for the full appreciation of the fashion in which degeneration relates itself to the other conditions of life. From the preceding reflections, it becomes clear that three possibilities of life await each living being. Either it remains primitive and unchanged, or it progresses towards a higher type, or last of all, it backslides and retrogresses. The first condition, that of stability, is, as already noted, perfectly consistent with the doctrine of descent, and the two latter conditions also form part and parcel of that theory. The stable state forces the animal to remain as it now is, or as it has been in all times past. The progressive tendency will make it a more elaborate animal, and the progress of degeneration will, on the other hand, tend to simplify its structure. It requires no thought to perceive that progress is a great fact of nature. The development of every animal and plant shows the possibilities of nature in this direction, but the bearings of degeneration and physiological backsliding are not, perchance, so clearly seen. Hence, to this latter aspect of biology we may now specially direct our attention. That certain animals degenerate or retrogress in their development before our eyes today is a statement susceptible of ready and familiar illustration. No better illustrations of this statement can be found than those derived from the domain of parasitic existence. When an animal or plant attaches itself partly or wholly to another living being and becomes more or less dependent upon the latter for support and nourishment, it exhibits as a rule retrogression and degeneration. The parasitic guest, dependent on its host for lodging alone, or it may be for both board and lodging, is in a fair way to become degraded in structure, and as a rule exhibits degradation of a marked kind, where the association has persisted sufficiently long. Parasitism and servile dependence act very much in structural lower life, as analogous instances of mental dependence on others act in ourselves. The destruction of characteristic individuality and the extinction of personality are natural results of that form of association wherein one form becomes absolutely dependent on another for all the conditions of life. A life of mere attachment exhibits similar results, and organs of movement disappear by the law of disuse. A digestive system is a superfluity to an animal which, like a tapeworm, obtains its food ready-made in the very kitchen, so to speak, of its host. Hence, the lack of a digestive apparatus follows the finding of a free commissariat by the parasite. Organs of sense are not necessary for an attached and rooted animal. These latter, therefore, go by the board, and the nervous system itself becomes modified and altered. Degradation, wholesale and complete, is the penalty the parasite has to pay for its free board and lodging. And in this fashion, nature may be said to revenge the host for the pains and troubles wherewith, like the just of old, he may be tormented. Numerous life histories testify clearly enough to the correctness of the foregoing observations. Take as an example the history of Sacculina, which exists as a bag-like growth attached to the bodies of hermit crabs and sends root-like processes into the liver of its host. No sign of life exists in a Sacculina beyond mere pulsation of the sac-like body, into and from which water flows by an aperture. Lay open this sac, and we shall find the animal to be a bag of eggs and nothing more. But trace the development of a single egg, and one may derive therefrom lessons concerning living beings at large, and open out issues which spread and extend far afield from Sacculina and its kin. Each egg of the sac-like organism develops into a little active creature, possessing 3 pairs of legs, generally a single eye, but exhibiting no mouth or digestive system, parasitism having affected the larva as well as the adult. Sooner or later, this larva, known as the nauplius, will develop a kind of bivalve shell. The 2 hinder pairs of limbs are cast off and replaced by 6 pairs of short swimming feet, whilst the front pair of limbs develops to form 2 elongated organs, whereby the young Sacculina will shortly attach itself to a crab host. When the latter event happens, the 6 pairs of swimming feet are cast off, the body assumes its sac-like appearance, and the Sacculina sinks into its adult stage, a pure example of degradation by habit, use, and want. So also with certain near neighbors of these crab parasites, such as the Lernians, which adhere to the gills of fishes. Beginning life as a 3-legged nauplius, the Lernian retrogresses and degenerates to become a mere elongated worm, devoted to the production of eggs, and exhibiting but little advance on the Sacculina. There are dozens of low crustaceans which, like Sacculina, afford examples of animals which are free and locomotive in the days of their youth, but which, losing eyes, legs, digestive system, and all ordinary belongings of animal life, go to the bad as the natural result of participating in what has been well named the vicious cycle of parasitism. Plainly marked as are the foregoing cases, there are yet other familiar crustaceans which, although not parasites as a rule, nevertheless illustrate animal retrogression in an excellent manner. Such are the sea acorns, Balani, which stud the rocks by thousands at low water mark, and such are the barnacles that adhere to floating timber and the sides of ships. In the development of sea acorns and barnacles, the first stage is essentially like that of the Sacculina. The young barnacle, as our previous studies have shown, is a nauplius, 3-legged, free-swimming, single-eyed, and possessing a mouth and digestive apparatus. In the next stage we again meet with the 6 pairs of swimming feet seen in the Sacculina, with the enormously developed front pair of legs serving as feelers, and with 2 magnificent compound eyes, as Darwin describes the organs of vision. The mouth in this second stage, however, is closed, and feeding is therefore impossible. As Darwin remarks, the function of the young barnacle, quote, at this stage, is to search out their well-developed organs of sense and to reach by their active powers of swimming a proper place on which to become attached, and to undergo their final metamorphosis. When this is completed, adds Darwin, they are fixed for life. Their legs are now converted into prehensile organs, they again obtain a well-constructed mouth, but they have no antennae, and their 2 eyes are now reconverted into a minute, single, simple eye spot, unquote. A barnacle is thus simply a highly modified crab-like animal which fixes itself by its head to the floating log, and which kicks its food into its mouth with its feet, to use the simile and description of biological authority. The development of its shell and stalk are matters which do not in the least concern its place in the animal series. These latter are local and personal features of the barnacle tribe. For in the sea acorns, which pass through an essentially similar development, there is no stalk, and the animal after its free-swimming stage simply glues its head, by a kind of marine cement of its own manufacture, to the rock, develops its conical shell, and, like the barnacle, uses its modified feet as means for exercising the commissariat and nutritive function. It is true that in some respects the adult barnacle may be regarded as lower than the young, and therefore as a degenerate being. Thus it is lower when eyes, feelers, and movements are taken into account. In other respects the adult may be considered of higher organization than the larva. These higher traits we may logically enough suppose represent the special advances which adult barnacle life has made on its own account. But on the whole, degradation and retrogression, if not so fully exemplified as in the Saculina, is still plainly enough illustrated in barnacle history. When we further reflect that even such high crustaceans as prawns and allied forms begin life each as a nauplius or under an allied guise, we not only merely discover the common origin of all crustaceans in some form represented by the nauplius of today, but we also witness the possibilities of development which have placed shrimps, prawns, etc., in the foremost rank of the class, and which conversely have left the barnacles and saculinas through the action of degenerative changes amongst the groundlings of the group. End of section 41. Chapter 15, The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 1. Section 42 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 2. The assumption of a sedentary life, whether parasitic in nature like that of Saculina, or whether represented by mere attachment and fixation to some inorganic thing, as in the case of the barnacles, is therefore seen to operate in the direction of producing degeneration of the animal's constitution. The tendency of such habit towards simplification of structure, and not towards that progressive advance in evolution which, in the case of the higher crustacean races, have evolved from the relatively simple nauplius of the past, the crabs, lobsters, shrimps, and prawns of today. In groups of the animal series, however, both nearly allied to the crustacean class and far removed from it in structure, equally interesting and often curious examples of degradation can be found. The class of insects and the nearly related group Arachnida, including the mites, spiders, and scorpions as its representatives, number in their ranks instances of degraded and degenerate forms. Amongst the insects which are parasitic in habits, a notable absence of wings is discernible, and this latter want is seen even in those cases in which one sex alone of a particular insect species assumes the habit in question. An excellent illustration of such a fact, and also of the extreme modification of form which may accompany the degeneracy of higher organized animals, is found in the history of the insects collectively known as Strepsiptera, and of which the genus Stylops is the best known example. The male Stylops is an active insect, possessing a single pair of wings. These wings are the hinder pair, the front pair being represented by a pair of twisted organs which illustrate wing degeneration, possibly through disuse. Both males and females, as they leave the egg, are small, active, six-legged beings which crawl about on the bodies of bees. Carried into the hive, the young Stylops behave like the proverbial viper, injuring the community which gives them shelter by boring their way into the bodies of larval or infant bees. Here the young Stylops, casting their skin, become in the larval interior sluggish, footless grubs. Each possesses a mouth, small jaws, and a digestive system of simple construction. Meanwhile, bee development progresses, and as the larval bee passes through its chrysalis stage, with its Stylops lodger contained in its interior, the latter thrusts the front extremity of its body from between two of the hinder body segments of the bee. Then the male Stylops, undergoing development in this position, becomes the winged insect and passes into the world. The female Stylops, on the other hand, remain in their places on the bees. They undergo but a slight change of form, persisting as mere sac-like bodies without legs or digestive system, and develop in their interior the eggs from which succeeding generations of Stylops will be produced. Such a case of absolute degeneracy is all the more remarkable in view of the facts that it is limited to one sex alone, and that the free-winged males of Stylops are as highly organized as most of their neighbor insects. The class of spiders, Arachnida, offers collective examples of degeneration and retrogression, which show how large numbers of animals may acquire lower characters, contrasting with the higher phases to which other members of their class have attained. The mites and ticks have unquestionably originated from the same rootstock as the spiders and scorpions. The development of the two groups proves this much. But whilst the latter animals have advanced to a high complexity of organization, the mites and ticks have degenerated into parasitic forms, or at least exemplify beings which, first attaining a respectable rank in their own series, have certainly not advanced upon that rank. Many of the mites, however, exhibit well-marked degeneration. Only on the hypothesis of sweeping retrogression can we account for the singular and anomalous condition in which a certain harmless mite, named Demodex folliculorum, spends its existence. This mite inhabits the sacs or follicles of the human skin at the sides of the nose. It is a minute, worm-like animal possessing 8 degenerate rudiments of legs and a thoroughly rudimentary structure in other respects. Here, parasitism has denuded the animal of well-nigh every attribute of its arachnidin character and has left it in a condition analogous, in many respects, to Saculina itself. Of the equally curious Linguaculuna, inhabiting the frontal sinuses or forehead spaces of dogs, wolves, horses, and sheep, the same remark holds good. The body here is thoroughly worm-like in shape, and a digestive and nervous system are to be enumerated among the possessions of the organism. But not even the rudiments of legs are to be perceived, although the mouth bears certain apologies for the appendages proper to that region in the mite and spider class. Yet the young Linguaculina exactly resembles the early form of the mites. It possesses 2 pairs of jointed limbs and certain style-like organs pertaining to the mouth. There is thus the clearest evidence that Linguaculina is a degraded animal. It is a degenerate descendant of a free-living and apparently 4-legged, or it may be 8-legged ancestor, and its further history seems to afford a clue to the causes of its retrogression. For the 4-legged larvae of the Linguaculina escape while still within the egg from the nose of the dog or sheep host which has harbored their parents. Received along with food into the body of the hare or rabbit, the larval being liberates itself. From the rabbit's digestive system it bores its way through the tissues to the liver, thus reminding one strongly of the similar migrations of the embryo tapeworm. In the liver, further changes ensue. Frequent moltings become the order of the day, and at length they assume a worm-like aspect, and remain thus, still imperfect, until by transference to the body of dog, wolf, or sheep, and by passage to the frontal sinuses, they acquire perfection of their life functions. If the history of these beings teaches us anything concerning their past, it points to a free and active state as their original condition, and to the probable acquirement first of a lodgment in the digestive system of one animal as a relatively simple parasite, and secondly, of a further modification of habit transferring at once its perfection and completed degradation to the forehead cavities of a second host. But the conditions which make for the degeneracy of an animal are, as we have seen in the case of the barnacles, not always associated with a parasitic habit. Mere fixation, as we have observed, secures the disappearance of useless organs, such as organs of motion and sense organs, which, being possessed by the young form, clearly indicate that the ancestry of the animals in question has at any rate been capable of leading to better things than the descendants represent in their existent persons. The sea squirts, or ascidians, besides serving as a text for the derivation of vertebrates and for abnormal ways in the animal chemistry which imitates the plant's work, have been selected as fruitful objects of discussion by those biologists who find in the idea of degeneration an explanation of knotty points in natural history. For the same voice that proclaims the fact that a sea squirt, which is a mere rooted bag with a double neck, begins life as a free-swimming, tadpole-like larva, tells us in the same breath that there must have been retrogression and degeneration from an active condition to produce the sac-like adult state. The assertion that the youthful sea squirt, moreover, possesses first a rod-like body, called a notochord, only found, besides, in the young of vertebrate animals, is also to be taken as implying the superiority of ascidian infancy to sea squirt maturity. And when it is added that the elderly squirt wants the sense organs and nervous cord which the larva possesses, it may well be argued that sheer degeneracy of habit and structure can alone account for the sweeping transformations which mark the phases of ascidian life history. Thus it is a matter of sober natural history fact that a sea squirt larva of all invertebrate animals is the only being that possesses organs and parts proper to the young vertebrate or to the adult form of one lower vertebrate in particular. This adult is the little fish known as the lancelet, which, in the relative simplicity of its organization, makes a nearer approach to the poor or sea squirt relations of the vertebrates than any other fish. The fact of vertebrate and sea squirt relationship is worth dwelling upon, because the topic unquestionably presents one with a common point of view, whence a survey of the higher development, evolution, and progress of the vertebrates, and a view of the degeneracy and retrogression of the sea squirts may best be obtained. Reveling in the freedom of its early life, the larval sea squirt, presenting, as already noted, a striking resemblance to the tadpole of the frog, in its backbone, its nerve system, and its breathing sac, or modified throat, ultimately settles down. Like the youthful barnacle somewhat, the young sea squirt attaches itself to a stone or shell by the suckers with which nature has provided its head. Then succeeds the disappearance of the tail with its backbone and its nerve cord, and the body itself soon assumes the sac-like shape that betokens the mature ascidian character. The outer skin becomes tough and leathery and develops the cellulose which by biological right we might expect to find in plants alone. Then succeeds the fuller formation of the gill sac or breathing chamber and of its neighbor compartment, which receives the effete water of respiration to be ejected by the second mouth of the sac-like body. The eye of the larva likewise disappears, and all that remains to the adult ascidian is a nerve mass called by courtesy the brain, and which serves to regulate the few acts that mark the placid and rooted existence of the race. Attention has been recently directed in a special manner to the resemblance which exists between the eye of the larval sea squirt and that of vertebrates, a statement to be taken along with that which conversely declares the unlikeness of the ascidian eye to that of all other invertebrate animals. It is matter of fact that the chief parts of the eye of a vertebrate animal grow inwards as developments from the skin, and unite with an outgrowth from the brain. This outgrowth forms the retina, or nervous network of the eye, whereon the images of things seen are duly received for transmission to brain and sensorium. Now, in invertebrate animals, the retina is formed from the skin layer. This latter method of growth, it has been remarked, is a perfectly natural one. It was to be expected that, as the retina is to be affected in the discharge of its duty by light rays, it should form on the surface of the body where the light rays fall. In the vertebrate and in the sea squirt larva, the retina, on the contrary, forms away below the skin surface and grows outwards from the brain. Why is this so? Professor Ray Lancaster maintains that because the ascidian larva is perfectly transparent, the light rays pass through to its brain eye and thus give rise to sensations of sight. Hence, if the original and primitive vertebrate animal or rootstock were like the larval sea squirt, as we suppose it to have been, its body would be transparent, and its eye or eyes, situated on its brain, would receive light rays through its clear body. But as the evolution of the vertebrate race proceeded, the tissues became firmer and denser. By natural selection, or in other words, by the exercise of accommodating power to function, the eyed region of the brain would tend to grow more and more towards the body's surface to receive the rays of light. As development therefore advanced, the mode of growth of the vertebrate eye would be adapted to the exigencies of its new surroundings. Thus, today, the vertebrate eye grows from without inwards, because light rays strike naturally on the outer surface of the body. But it likewise grows from within outwards as well, because of the ancestral and hereditary tendencies which cause it to repeat, in the individual growth, the passage to the surface it had to make in the evolution of the race. If one might add a suggestion to such an explanation, it would consist in an endeavor to account for that affinity between brain and outer surface of body which we see to exist. Why the brain should grow outwards, as it does in eye, ear, and nose likewise, to connect with the body's surface, and so to form organs of sense, is plain enough. We must bear in mind that the brain itself is formed from the outer layer or epiblast of the larva, and from the same layer which develops into the skin. Brain and skin, to begin with, arise from the same layer. Hence, before even the matter of eyes falls to be considered, the affinity of the skin layer and the nervous system is a fact worth noting. It is this truest of relationships which may reasonably enough explain not merely why the sense organs arise from the skin surface, but also why the brain grows outwards to meet with the structure to which it is so near akin. Degeneration of a very pronounced kind thus accounts for the peculiarities of sea squirt structure today. The case of ascidian retrogression is likewise the more interesting seeing that its reverse side is that of progressive evolution and development of the highest forms of life the existing world knows. It is therefore important to note in passing that the possibilities of development may include degeneration of a very marked type, along with progressive evolution of an equally pronounced kind. The category of life's extension includes, in fact, many possibilities which at first sight might appear of most unlikely kind, and amongst these possibilities, that of extreme degeneration is by no means the least notable as an element in inducing the material variety of life we behold in the animal and plant worlds of today. The list of causes which lead to the degeneration of living beings includes, however, other fashions of producing retrogression than by fixation and parasitic habits, and operates in different ways upon organisms of varied structure and of different social or biological rank. Changes in food and feeding may thus accomplish degeneration and induce physiological backsliding of the most typical description. It is a familiar fact that the animal organism is of relatively higher nature than the plant, seeing that the animal frame can, as a rule, feed upon and build up its tissues from organic or living matter only. Animals, in other words, demand the substance of other animals or of plants, or of both combined, as a necessity of their commissariat arrangements. Plants, on the other hand, are specially constructive and elaborative in their feeding. They build up from the non-living matters around them, carbonic acid, water, ammonia, and minerals, the tissues of their living bodies. They transubstantiate this non-living matter into living tissue, and the verdant tints of spring, the full glory of the summer's blossom, or the mellow ruddiness of autumn's fruits represents, each in its way, the result at once of the plant's constructive chemistry and of the elaboration into living matter of the inorganic materials of air and soil around. The animal frame therefore presents us, amid exceptions to the above rule in both animal and plant series, with relatively greater complexity of organs and tissues than the plant body presents. This statement simply re-echoes what commonplace observation daily demonstrates. Hence, it may be a natural enough inference that whatever causes tend to bring the animal feeding nearer in type to that of the plant will tend to simplify animal structure, and so to produce retrogression and degeneration of the animal type. Many animals are thus known to develop chlorophyll, or the green color we see characteristically in every leaf. Through the combined operation of this green color, either singly or aided by the leaf protoplasm and the action of light, plants decompose the carbonic acid of the air, as every schoolboy knows. They then retain the carbon to aid in the formation of starch, and set free the oxygen, which thus returns to the atmosphere and is welcomed by the animal hosts. The hydra, or common freshwater polyp, many animalcules, and certain worms of a low type possess this chlorophyll. Like dishonest manufacturers, they seem to have infringed the patent rights of the plant to elaborate this green color. And it is no longer matter of theory, but ascertained fact, that these green animals are capable, like the plants, of absorbing carbonic acid, usually a fatal gas to the animal constitution, and of elaborating starch therefrom like their plant neighbors. Thus, a simpler mode of feeding, obviating the necessities of animal existence in the way of digestive apparatus, has apparently led to the simplification of structure. Degeneration has followed in the worms just mentioned as the result of their imitation and acquirement of vegetative powers of feeding, and it is probable that other alterations in the way of dietary of less sweeping character than that just mentioned will affect, in like retrogressive fashion, the animal constitution. End of section 42. Chapter 15. The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 2. Section 43 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 3. Some of the most curious cases of degeneration known to us illustrate the total disappearance of digestive apparatus, even in some beings, in which, as in the stylops already mentioned, one sex becomes retrogressive whilst the other sex remains structurally fully developed. Such a case is illustrated by the males of those remarkable organisms, the Rotifera, or wheel animalcules. These minute creatures inhabiting our fresh waters may be desiccated and dried and revived on the application of moisture many times in succession. But in their ordinary existence and in the details of their structure, the wheel animalcules present details equally interesting with their exhibition of potential vitality. The female animalcules possess a complete digestive system, a set of water vessels, a nervous ganglion, and other belongings, but their partners are decidedly inferior creatures, since their digestive system becomes totally abortive, whilst in size the males are likewise far excelled by the lady rotifers. How this degeneration and disappearance of digestive apparatus and the inferiority of size have been produced in the male rotifers may be a matter regarding which difference of opinion will certainly exist in biological minds. The fact that retrogression is here illustrated, however, cannot be questioned. It may also be added that, in all probability, the extreme development of the function of perpetuating the species and the extraordinary fertility of production witnessed in these animalcules may satisfactorily account for the abrogation of digestion in favor of reproduction. Thus, to the other causes of degeneration in animal life and structure, we may append that which takes origin from the extreme or excessive development of one function over another. Physiological development in one direction, overstepping the natural and ordinary limits, runs concurrently with destruction of life's equilibrium, and naturally tends to produce degeneration and simplification of other organs and of other duties of life. How far the theory of degeneration we have thus briefly discussed may be applied in explanation of the peculiarities of animal structure remains as a task for the future of biology to satisfactorily determine. Possibly the corrections which the future of every hypothesis carries with it may be many and sweeping. The deductions and inferences we extract from a study of degeneration today may perchance be falsified by the higher and newer views of the tomorrow of biological science. But enough has been said to show that, even in a cursory review of the doctrine of degeneration and retrogression, many phases of living histories become theoretically plain. And it argues hopefully for the correctness and value of the doctrine before us that it has, so far as it has been logically pursued, fitted compactly and harmoniously enough with ascertained facts and with received views of the origin of animals and plants. That higher forms of life than the sea squirt and insect race are by no means exempt from the influence of retrogressive change is an observation worth noting at the close of our researches. We know, for instance, of lowly structures in shellfish life appearing in the midst of highly organized frames. A mussel, a cockle, or an oyster, whose early development, as we have seen, runs in parallel lines to that of the snail and whelk class, is nevertheless esteemed less highly organized than the latter. The mussel or oyster tribe possesses no head. The snails and their allies, as everyone knows, not merely exhibit a well-developed head, but have that extremity provided with eyes, tentacles or feelers, and other addenda of the front region of the animal body. Hence it is more than probable that the mussel, headless and enclosed in its shell, and possessing relatively little interest in the affairs of the outer world, is an example of a degenerate type of mollusks. The mussels and their relations stand, in fact, at the opposite extreme of development in this respect from those well-known mollusks, the cuttlefishes. In these creatures, the tendency to head development, or what Professor Dana calls cephalization, reaches its maximum, as anyone may readily enough suppose on looking at an octopus or squid with its great head, its enormous eyes, and its nerves massed together to form a brain enclosed in a kind of skull. Even as compared with the earlier cuttlefishes, whose shells, under the name of ammonites and the like, we find fossilized in large numbers, the squids and cuttles of today present, in the extreme development of head, a noteworthy advance. Thus, whilst the one molluscan tribe of mussels and their neighbors has degenerated and gone to its own lowly place in the series, other groups starting on an equal footing have advanced, and through progressive evolution have produced those higher manifestations of molluscan life that teem in the seas of today. Even amongst the vertebrate animals we meet with examples of degenerative tendency which are not so easily explicable as the foregoing illustrations. In most snakes, only one lung is fully developed as a rule, the companion organ being rudimentary and degenerate. In birds, the egg-producing organs are similarly developed on one side only. How degeneration should be thus partial and affect one half of an animal's frame, so to speak, is very hard to discover. External conditions of life and the influences of surroundings could apparently possess little effect in inducing such an unsymmetrical retrogression of parts. Most probably, we shall find the solution of such conditions to exist within the operation of some deep-seated law of the living constitution, and in the effects of that law in molding or even contorting the animal frame. It constitutes one of the chief glories of biological science, as pursued amongst us today, that its studies are of far-reaching order, and lead, as the results of their natural extension, to the consideration of fields of thought often widely removed from the original topic which interests the reader. The present subject of degenerative changes, regarded as part and parcel of the living constitution, can readily be shown to possess applications far removed from zoology and botany, and extending into the most intimate spheres and phases of human history itself. Degenerative change in human tissues is medically symptomatic of very many of the ills to which flesh is heir. Tissues and organs degenerate in individual animals as animal frames retrogress in their entirety. Cells retrograde and fibers degenerate in our bodies, just as the sea squirt's frame exhibits as a whole a universal physiological backsliding. Nor may many of our diseases alone be esteemed mere examples of degeneration affecting our tissues. The termination and decline of life itself, and the age that really melts in unperceived decay, are in reality examples of natural degeneration also. The decline of existence is largely a retrogression of structure. There can be no such thing as a really green old age, any more than we can speak of the sere and yellow of the autumnal leaf as imitating the verdant nature of the spring blossom. Nay, stranger still is it to discern that the full flush of life's vigor is accompanied by degenerative changes as typical as those which mark life's decline. For every tissue wastes as it works, and cells degenerate, die, and are cast off from every surface and tissue of our frames as the natural result of living and being. Generally speaking, says a writer in discussing the degeneration of human tissues, quote, those parts which live most slowly are those of which the duration is the greatest, and in which there is consequently the least frequent change. Of the exuviation of epidermic structures en masse, a process altogether comparable to the fall of the leaf, we have striking examples in the entire desquamation of serpents, the molting of the plumage in birds, and the shedding of the hair in mammalia. And in the shedding of the antlers of the stag, we have an example of the exuviation of a highly organized and vascular part, which periodically dies, and which, being external, is cast off entire. What means all this, says Sir James Paget, but that these organs have their severally appointed tissues, degenerate, die, are cast away, and in due time are replaced by others, which in their turn are to be developed to perfection, to live their life in the mature state, and to be cast off, unquote. And again, the same high authority remarks that, quote, it is further probable that no part of the body is exempt from the second source of impairment, that, namely, which consists in the natural death or deterioration of the parts, independent of the death and decay of the whole body, after a certain period of their life. It may be proved, partly by demonstration and partly by analogy, that each integral or element part of the body is formed for a certain natural period of existence in the ordinary conditions of active life, at the end of which period, if not previously destroyed by outward force or exercise, it degenerates and is absorbed, or dies and is cast out, needing in either case to be replaced for the maintenance of health, unquote. To these weighty words we may lastly add the opinion of Dr. Carpenter, who remarks that, quote, when the adult type has once been completely attained, every subsequent change is one rather of degeneration than of development, of retrogression rather than of advance, unquote. Degeneration is thus an invariable concomitant of life. So far from being in any way an abnormal phase of living action, it is seen to be as natural a process for living beings to retrogress, wholly as we have seen in some cases, or partly in others, as it is for them to develop and advance. And what is thus undoubtedly true of the individual man or other animal is no less so of the race. Buried civilizations are by no means unknown. Extinct culture is an archaeological fact. The decline and fall of nations is a matter of history. May not these things be likewise explained as a part of that wide theory of life which regards even the highest interests of man as lying within the operation and sway of causes which mold his physical organization? If this notion be accepted, then is the idea of degeneration as a normal phase of life rendered still more feasible and plain. Reaching to the individual and to the species as well, extending and including in its scope the lowly organized as well as the higher being, affecting one group or class lightly and influencing another well nigh to the complete exclusion of progress. We find degeneration and retrogression to be numbered among the stern realities of existence. And no less clearly and forcibly may we trace the truly natural place of degeneration in our own physical history, since, as physiology teaches and daily experience declares, not an action is wrought or a thought conceived without the presence of change and decay of tissue, a process this which, limited in early life by progressive growth and by development, at last comes in our latter days to assume the reins of government, and in time to dissipate our energy and substance into the nothingness of physical and corporate extinction. The philosophy of biology, however, may, in conclusion, be found to point out to us that the subject of degeneration, whilst treating of a powerful factor in modifying the living form, yet possesses a favorable aspect in relation to progress and evolution. High authority in matters biological may be found for the statement that degeneration is really a result of progress, that it is dependent on high development, and that whilst it simplifies the living being, quote, it produces the same effects as differentiation, for it leads to variety in form, unquote. Thus there is a kind of evolution and progress inseparable even from degeneration itself, for the retrogression may in itself lead to variety and change, and in due time such variety may be the starting point of new and higher developments. So likewise we are reminded that reduction and degeneration of some parts may proceed contemporaneously with the higher development of others, with the total result of perfecting the organism and evolving a higher type of structure. The degeneration of a frog's tail is in reality a feature of its higher type as compared with its tailed friends, the newts and salamanders. The disappearance and reduction of the tail which the young crab possesses is a chief reason why we esteem the crab, whose body is all head and chest, a higher animal than the lobster or prawn, with head, chest, and tail complete. The degeneration of the outside gills of the alpine salamander's young, which never have access to water, is not a mark of inferiority, but of superiority. It is, in reality, the casting off of the old or larval and aquatic characters and the putting on of the new and higher features of the land animal. Even the degeneration of human structures, the modification of the tail which early human existence exhibits, and of muscular structures well developed in lower life, are no proofs of inferiority, but are evidences of superiority in ourselves. Thus, even in the great work of evolving higher races out of the lower, to degeneration much is owing for its aid in repressing larval characters and the structures which belong to lower existences. Whilst progressive evolution develops the great tree of life, extends each branch, clothes it with verdure, and expands each blossom, it is degeneration which lops the worn and aged stems, prunes the weakly foliage, trims the budding growths, and so directs and molds the outlines of the organic whole. It is to evolution and progress that the world of life largely owes its forward march. But hardly less is the debt of gratitude due by the living host to degenerative change and retrogression, which, though stern and ofttimes cruel in their ways, nevertheless mark wisely and well the pathways of life, and prevent the useless and weak from cumbering the ground. End of Section 43, Chapter 15, The Evidence from Degeneration, Part 3. Section 44 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Geology and Evolution, Part 1. Allusion has frequently been made in preceding chapters to the fact that the deductions of geology and the theory of evolution possess many relations in common. The relationship in question has been demonstrated more than once in the course of our inquiries into the evidence which living nature presents of the truth of the development theory. For example, the case for missing links and for the substantiation or denial of the connected series of beings which evolution postulates was seen to be one which must stand or fall accordingly as the geological evidence revealed the existence of links or not. If the history of the fossil contents of the rock formations could be shown to include no examples whatever of the transitional forms between species which the evolutionist demands, it is clear that the validity of his special conception of the order of nature would thereby be seriously impugned. The least cultured critic of the theory of descent would naturally turn to the geological evidence in search of confirmation or refutation of the views advanced by the followers of Mr. Darwin. Hence, in the early days of evolution, when the theory was in its infancy, the relations of geology to this conception of nature were foreseen to be of a kind demanding the most careful attention from both promulgators and opponents of the hypothesis of descent. In this view of matters, the chapters on the origin of species, dealing with the imperfections of the geological record and with the geological succession of organic beings, have always been regarded with special interest alike by evolutionists and their opponents. Mr. Darwin had undoubtedly felt the high importance of the geological side of the great question he had propounded before the world of thought. The two chapters just mentioned bear plain evidence of the painstaking care with which the venerable author of the classic work marshaled the evidence at hand, and with which also he reviewed the conclusions to which that evidence seemed to point. A perusal of the chapters in question will serve to show how consistently the facts of geology may be placed beside those revealed by the study of the life that exists today, and how the facts of life's past development often support, whilst they never negative, the ideas on which the evolutionist bases his belief. The aspects which the geological evidence offers for the attention of the evolutionist are manifold in number and variety. Our study of missing links has already shown us that one special phase of geological inquiry relates to the existence in the fossil record of those forms which may be described as intermediate in nature between existing species. If we suppose that no such forms had been known to exist, we can conceive that whilst their absence would not absolutely have negatived the theory of evolution, the want of such evidence would have decidedly weakened the evolutionist case. The fullness with which the gaps have been supplied with even a relatively limited search in geological directions, has more than satisfied the evolutionist of the correctness of his deductions respecting the existence of the transitional forms he would expect the life of past eons to have exhibited. A second phase of geological inquiry in relation to the theory of descent is found in the question of past time and its duration. The objection has naturally been urged that if natural selection has operated in the past by the production of minute variations, acting through periods of immense antiquity, the drafts which the evolutionist is compelled to make on the bank of time are so great that collapse of the theory is the result. Physicists of the highest eminence have formulated opinions based on apparently stable data regarding the age of our planet. It has accordingly been urged that, assuming the most extended antiquity which such opinions allow, there yet remains a deficit in the age of the Earth compared with the demands or with the expectations of the evolutionist. But to all such speculations and considerations there remains one sufficient answer. So long as we are comparatively ignorant of the exact factors to which the work of evolution is due, it is idle to speculate on the time required for the change and modification of species. That specific change may have occasionally been more rapid in past ages than at present is an idea for which there is considerable justification to be found in the history of the living beings we are able to study. Again, with imperfect knowledge of the progress and succession of climatal and other changes in the past, and with but shadowy ideas regarding the possibilities of biological change today, we have ample reason to regard the relations of time past to evolution as by no means so simple as certain opinions would appear to indicate. The evidence of geology itself, whilst rejecting the ancient ideas of catastrophism and of sudden cataclysmal changes, nevertheless must be held as proving that cosmical and physical actions have not always presented the phases we see exemplified before our eyes today. In a word, until we have at hand fuller evidence regarding the manifest interaction between cosmical alteration and biological change, between physical revolutions and their effect upon the life of our globe, all speculations concerning the duration of time past in its relation to evolution must be held as purely tentative and provisional. The case for evolution, as indicated in our previous studies, is so overwhelmingly strong when we regard the evidence from biology alone that the evolutionist may well be pardoned if he is inclined to turn a deaf ear to any arguments against his theory which are derived from data so manifestly imperfect in their details as those on which speculations concerning past time and life development are based. As bearing in the most intimate manner on this very question of time in relation to evolution, it may be interesting to point out that vast periods of unrepresented time must be allowed for in all considerations connected with the past history of the Earth. If we tabulate the various fossil-bearing rock formations in the order in which they occur in nature, the following table will represent their succession. Cainozoic period, recent life. Post-tertiary and recent, Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene. Mesozoic period, middle life, Cretaceous or Chalk, Oolite or Jurassic, Trias. Paleozoic period, ancient life, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian or Old Red Sandstone, Silurian, Cambrian, and Huronian, Laurentian. This table shows us that the fossil-bearing rocks are arranged in a very definite order and succession, the lowest and therefore the oldest series being the Paleozoic rocks, which in turn possess the Laurentian group as their most ancient formations, and the Permian rocks as their newest. Above these again lie the Mesozoic rocks, with the Trias lying above the Permian as their oldest, and the Chalk reposing in turn on the Oolite as their youngest beds respectively. The Cainozoic rocks form the last and most recent series of all. They lie upon the Chalk, their oldest strata being those named the Eocene, and their youngest formations the soils and gravels of today. It is needless to remark that this tabular order is never anywhere seen in its entirety. Geological revolution disturbing the strata has produced many and serious breaks in their continuity, but such gaps do not affect the order of their succession tabulated by the geologist. That is to say, the Permian, for example, wherever found, must overlie the coal, as the latter in turn invariably lies above the Devonian. The complete thickness of the stratified rocks alone, or in other words, their thickness, exclusive of volcanic or igneous rocks, in Britain is given by Professor Ramsay as 72,584 feet, or as Mr. Darwin has put it, quote, very nearly 13 3/4 British miles. Some of the formations, continues Mr. Darwin, which are represented in England by these beds are thousands of feet in thickness on the continent. Moreover, between each successive formation, we have, in the opinion of most geologists, blank periods of enormous length, unquote. Now it is these blank periods which certainly affect, in the plainest fashion, all questions concerning the operation of biological change in its relations to time past. It is necessary here to bear in mind a few elementary geological axioms, such as the fact that only those rocks, the aqueous or stratified rocks, which have been formed in water contain fossils, and that the igneous or volcanic rocks cannot be expected, from the mere fashion of their formation, to present any traces of past life. Thus it is clear the aqueous or fossil-bearing rocks must have been formed either in the beds of oceans or in shallow water along coastlines or in lakes or at the mouths of rivers, the materials for these rocks being supplied by the wear and tear of previously existing formations. The nature of the included fossils is often the best guide to the exact site wherein the soft materials were deposited to form the strata of future epochs. Thus, the presence of fossilized corals, starfishes, and marine forms of fishes would indicate that the formations containing these fossils had been deposited in a seabed, just as the discovery of freshwater shells and plants in another series of strata would show that these latter beds were of lake origin, or as a mixture of freshwater and marine forms would suggest that the strata had been deposited in brackish water. The distinctness of any two or more series of strata is inferred by the geologist when he discovers differences in their included fossils, whilst he also possesses a criterion of their distinctness in their mineral characteristics. Now, each group of stratified rocks is more or less clearly characterized by possessing certain characteristic fossils, which in some cases may be absolutely confined and limited to the one group of formations, never passing into any other series, or may, on the other hand, extend from one group through another series or even through several successive formations. But we are accustomed to note that certain fossils specially characterize each formation and are characteristic of that formation, even when they may have been slightly developed prior to its period, or have passed beyond it into the next epoch. The comparative distinctness of the fossils in the several formations was formerly explained on the assumption that at the close of each period, the forms of life dwelling therein were extinguished and killed off by some sudden catastrophe. The life of the succeeding period was supposed to be produced by the special creation of new species, these in turn becoming extinct at the close of their particular epoch. Creation and extinction on this theory were thus alternating processes. The death of the one set of organisms heralded the production of the new and independent forms. Such a hypothesis, tenable enough, of course, on the theory of special creation, is diametrically opposed to that of evolution. But the case for the latter hypothesis was soon proved to be overwhelmingly strong when the facts relating to fossils were more fully investigated. Thus, when it is clear that all the forms represented as fossils in one series of rocks are not, as a rule, completely absent from the succeeding epoch, but are often found represented in the next period, the case for the special creation of each new series of fossils becomes materially weakened. Furthermore, just as lines of genetic relationship connect existing animals and plants, so like relations may be traced between extinct and fossil forms. Hence the theory that the fossil animals and plants of each period must represent the more or less typical descendants of the life of the preceding epoch at once rises into the domain of rational belief. If we can believe that each new period is thus peopled by the descendants of the preceding epoch and by the actual survivals from that period, the case for evolution grows in strength. And this belief is exactly that which modern geological science esteems to have been the true cause of the succession of life through the changing eons of the past. If the doctrine of evolution is sound, says Professor Huxley, quote, one of its immediate consequences clearly is that the present distribution of life upon the globe is the product of two factors, the one being the distribution which obtained in the immediately preceding epoch, and the other the character and extent of the changes which have taken place in physical geography between the one epoch and the other. Or, to put the matter in another way, the fauna and flora of any given area in any given epoch can consist only of such forms of life as are directly descended from those which constituted the fauna and flora of the same area in the immediately preceding epoch, unless the physical geography, under which I include climatal conditions, of the area has been so altered as to give rise to immigration of living forms from some other area." Unquote. The succession of life thus described offers convincing proofs of the correctness of the evolutionist views, and these proofs will be presently considered. The nature and influence of the breaks or blank periods of Mr. Darwin, which exists between the series, remain, however, for primary notice. The geologist finds ample cause, in his study of the rock masses, to assume that the periods of time which have elapsed between the end of one epoch and the beginning of the next have been of immense duration. That these periods are further blank and unrepresented by any tangible details in the Earth's history is also plain. It is a matter of geological detail, for example, to show how the phenomena known as unconformability, wherein one rock system lies athwart another, so to speak, alone proves the immensity of the period of time which intervened between their formation. Prior to and during this interval, migration of the species to be represented as fossils in the epoch which has just closed would unquestionably take place. We thus note how rocks formed in widely separated areas may contain like fossils. and also how the animals and plants of one period may have passed onwards to take part in the development of life in the next. Mr. Darwin's own words are highly succinct and convincing on the points just mooted. I have my reasons, says Mr. Darwin, quote, for believing that most of our great formations, rich in fossils, were deposited during periods of subsidence, and that blank intervals of vast duration, as far as fossils are concerned, occurred during the periods when the bed of the sea was either stationary or rising, and likewise when sediment was not thrown down quickly enough to embed and preserve organic remains. During these long and blank intervals, I suppose that the inhabitants of each region underwent a considerable amount of modification and extinction, and that there was much migration from other parts of the world. As we have reason to believe, continues Mr. Darwin, that large areas are affected by the same movement, it is probable that strictly contemporaneous formations have often been accumulated over very wide spaces in the same quarter of the world. But we are very far from having any right to conclude that this has invariably been the case, and that large areas have invariably been affected by the same movements. When two formations have been deposited in two regions during nearly, but not exactly, the same period, we should find in both, from the causes explained in the foregoing paragraphs, the same general succession in the forms of life. But the species would not exactly correspond, for there will have been a little more time in the one region than in the other for modification, extinction, and immigration." Unquote. It thus seems clear that on grounds connected with the lapse of past time in relation to life development on our globe, and also for reasons connected with the blank periods between the formations comprising its crust, the evolutionist may be content to assume, firstly, that questions connected with the duration of time past need not cause him any perturbation. He may secondly argue, with reason, that even when the question of unrepresented periods is alone considered, the evidence at hand tends to prove how life's succession is in reality continuous beneath the breaks in time, and in the order of rock formation, whilst he also notes how aptly the theory of descent harmonizes with the full consideration of the facts revealed by a study of the Earth's life history in the past. End of section 44, Chapter 16, Geology and Evolution, Part 1. Section 45 of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Geology and Evolution, Part 2. The question of the general succession of life on the Earth's surface presents an important series of considerations to the evolutionist view. In this latter study, it is interesting to note the theory of descent finds increased support, admitting to the full the great breaks which exist in the continuity of the rock formations comprising the crust of the globe, blank periods which in no way militate against the correctness of evolution. We still possess data of sufficient accuracy and extent to determine for us the general order in which life has been developed on the Earth's surface. The further back we pass in the history of the rock formations, the fewer are the resemblances we can detect to living animals and plants. Occasionally we meet with certain forms which seem to have persisted from the earliest times, and without material change, to the present day. Such are certain of those shellfish named brachiopods, and also many of the foraminifera. These have survived from a period so far back as the Silurian epoch, and appear before our eyes today as living forms in essentially the same guise as their fossil representatives. Such examples of unaltering life have already been shown in the chapter on Degeneration to be perfectly consistent with the doctrine of evolution. They represent species whose surroundings remain the same today as of yore, and whose tendencies to change are therefore practically non-existent. A glance at the table of rock formations already given will show that time past has been divided by the paleontologist into three great periods, insofar as the development of life is concerned. Thus, the rocks from the Laurentian, or oldest of the fossil-bearing series, to the Permian are collectively named Paleozoic, or ancient life, formations. Those from the Trias to the Chalk form the Mesozoic, or middle life period, whilst the rocks from the chalk to the soils of today collectively form the Cainozoic or recent life period. It is a matter of the most elementary study in geology to discover that the fossil animals and plants of the Paleozoic period are most unlike the existing life of the globe. The fossils of the Mesozoic rocks approach more nearly in character to the animals and plants around us, although also including many very divergent forms. In the Cainozoic rocks, on the other hand, we meet with a far larger proportion of fossils belonging to living or recent species. Broadly speaking, then, there has been a gradual development of life from forms unlike those around us today towards the existing life of the globe. But geology goes much further in its interpretation of the past life of our globe. There has been represented, in addition, a distinct development of higher from lower life as the ages have progressed. There have been progression and advance, as well as mere succession towards the likeness of existing life. If we turn to the oldest rocks, we find the fossils to include only those of low or primitive animals and plants. It is only as we pass to the newer rocks that we find traces of higher life. If we select any class of animals or plants, we do not discover, as would be expected if the theory of special creation were true, that all ranks and stages in that class appear simultaneously in the fossil record. On the contrary, the lower forms invariably precede the higher. Fishes, as the lowest vertebrates, thus precede other members of their type in time. The oldest fossil fishes occur in the upper Silurian rocks, and it is not until we arrive at the newer coal measures that we find the succeeding and higher class, that of the frogs or amphibians, represented. In the deposits, Permian, above the coal, the still higher reptiles first occur. Birds make their first appearance in the Mesozoic rocks, and the oldest mammals or quadrupeds are also of Mesozoic age. What holds true of vertebrate development applies also to the appearance of life at large on the Earth's surface. Where the fossil evidence that the lower members of a class appear before the higher seems doubtful, the discrepancy must be referred to that imperfection of the fossil record which constitutes an impassable barrier to our full and complete knowledge of the life of the past. But whatever sufficient materials are to be found, the great law of progression from lower to higher types of life is seen to be paramount as an expression of the manner in which the world has attained the fullness of its existing population. It need hardly be pointed out how powerfully the discovery of this progression in the past life of the globe supports the evolutionists' views. Instead of the sudden appearance of whole groups of high and unaltering organisms in the oldest formations, we are enabled to trace the gradual development of species. In the case of certain groups of animals, the evidence for the theory of development becomes singularly complete when we discover the exact course in which the evolution of new species by the modification of the old has taken place. Amongst the extinct trilobites and ammonites, for instance, the gradations between the various forms are often traceable with singular completeness, the gaps between the different species being frequently supplied in the most exact fashion. A notable feature in the life of the past consists in the observation that many extinct animals present characters which clearly belong to the young or embryonic condition of their type, rather than to the full-grown state, or to that seen in their existing representatives. This fact constitutes in itself a singularly powerful argument in favor of the evolutionist views. It shows that the progression of life in time past has been that which the development of animals today demonstrates. In other words, as the stages in development we see today repeat the ancestry of the developing animal, so these embryonic fossil forms represent the early and lower phases in the development of the species. The animal of today represents the cumulative advance of its race. It forms a striking confirmation of the evolution theory that we should discover in the debris of past epochs, and in the lower life of these epochs, the actual evidences of such advance. The conception of the evolutionist that the development of life is represented by a huge tree with its innumerable diverging branches and twigs is thus seen to fit the actual details of which his theory takes cognizance. The species of today represent the topmost or last developed leaves of the branches. Occasionally, we are able to trace the continuity of past and present along the branch and backwards to the stem. And even where this continuity is broken, it is interesting to note how the evidences of its former existence became clear when, in the shape of the lower and earlier fossils, we behold the scars and lopped branches showing the lines wherein the development of the past had progressed. The imperfection of the geological record has already formed the subject of a previous discussion. We traced the absence of many of the connecting links between existing groups of animals to the non-preservation of the forms of the past, as well as to the wholesale destruction of fossil histories, which changes to the rock masses undoubtedly involved. Despite the effect of such sweeping physical revolutions, the evidence for the existence of these links between existent forms, which evolution postulates, has been shown in not a few cases to be singularly complete. It is necessary, however, to refer more exactly in the present instance to the actual causes which have rendered the fossil record, at the best, of fragmentary nature. There are thus, firstly, certain groups of animals which, from the very nature of their habits, we could not expect to have been well represented by fossil species. Such forms as insects and birds, for example, could rarely be expected to become readily fossilized. Their habits lead them to exist in the majority of cases far from water, and the lightness of their bodies would largely preclude the probability of their frequent deposition amongst the debris of seas and lakes, such deposition being, of course, the natural prelude to their preservation as fossils. The comparative scarcity of bird and insect fossils fully attests the correctness of these deductions. What is true of these two groups holds equally good in the case of most land animals. By far the greater proportion of fossils consist of the remains of marine or aquatic forms, which naturally exist in the most favorable situation for becoming readily entombed in the soft deposits which form the rock formations of the future. Another important consideration which has had a notable influence in demonstrating why we can never hope to construct a full and complete history of the past history of life development consists in the fact that only the hard parts of animals and plants are, as a rule, capable of being preserved. Bones, teeth, and scales, along with shells and corals, are the structures which most commonly constitute the fossils found in rock formations. Although in a few instances the footprints of animals, the tracks of sea worms, and even the impress of a jellyfish have been discovered, the vast majority of fossils consist of the remains of those animals and plants which possessed hard parts and structures. If therefore we consider the enormous number of soft-bodied organisms which in this way can have left no trace whatever of their existence, one all-sufficient reason for the imperfection of the geological record is not difficult to find. Whilst this record is thus imperfect and at the best fragmentary, such evidence as we do possess regarding its nature will be found in no case to negative the conclusions to which evolution would guide us. The whole of the evidence which geology has to submit in reference to the life of the past clearly points to the idea of progression and modification of living beings as the only hypothesis which can fully explain and connect the facts of cosmical history. He who runs may literally read with pleasure and profit the story of life which is written in the records of the rocks, and that story is one of evolution and modification. Of special creation the rocks tell no tale, and life at large has nothing whatever to say in support of a tradition which belongs to the pre-scientific era of human thought. It may lastly be pointed out how closely and intimately the phases of geological history parallel those of biological growth. Time was when every phase of geological action was regarded as the result of a sudden catastrophe. Sudden physical revolution was but the counterpart of that special and independent creation of living beings in which the science of yesterday believed. Today, with wider and truer conceptions of both physical and biological history, both theories have been consigned to oblivion. As the uniformity of geological action supersedes the catastrophes of the past, so the evolution of life replaces the idea of its sudden creation. In each case, the supernatural unknowable action postulated by ancient belief is replaced by an efficient cause, the nature and direction of which can be investigated by mankind. From a detached, abrupt, and disconnected theory of nature, we have advanced toward a harmonious explanation of this world's order and towards a unity of cause, outside which, as the growth of science tends to show, no event of history, cosmical or human, can exist. End of section 45, chapter 16, Geology and Evolution, part 2. End of Chapters on Evolution by Andrew Wilson.